All right, so in the wake of our right-wing reactionary Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and stripping millions of Americans of some of their fundamental human rights, the Democratic Party has been hard at work reading poems and singing songs on the steps of the Supreme Court, and most importantly, racking their brains trying to figure out how they can simultaneously fundraise off of protecting abortion rights while also doing absolutely nothing to follow through on the promises they have made in regards to codifying Roe at the federal level. And it has gotten to a point where it is so embarrassing of a failure from the Democratic leadership class, as exemplified here by this absolutely corrupted and rotten ghoul, Nancy Pelosi. It's gotten so ridiculous at this point that even Republican operatives are basically laughing at Democrats in terms of how pathetic their response has been to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Just genuinely surprised that they have not been getting a more fierce pushback. So here from Puck News, Julia Ioffe, she says, the GOP inside conversation on Roe. During the past few days, I've been talking to Republican operatives across DC. They are all careful not to gloat, but they've also been shocked at how little the Democratic Party is doing to fight back. So a little bit of details here on what she found. She says, you would think that with a month of advance warning about how the Supreme Court was going to rule, the Democrats would have been better prepared for the day that Roe v. Wade finally fell. And yet, when it happened, Democrats did what Democrats do best. They made memes, get mad at each other, and do little of consequence. And there was a bit of private pearl clutching in Washington when AOC tweeted that her fellow party members need to stop fundraising off of the repeal of Roe and actually do something. Radical proposal there from AOC. How dare she? But even Republicans who had spent the last 2 years peddling the Dems in disarray line thought it was a little bit harsh, saying, I was surprised at AOC blaming the Democratic leadership. One GOP aide told me, I was like, whoa. I don't know why you would be like, whoa, because, obviously Republicans are the ones pushing this anti-abortion and anti-choice legislation, but Democrats, with their refusal to actually do anything to push back against it, they're basically just aiding and abetting this whole process. So if anything, this statement from AOC is a understatement, but they continue saying AOC hit on a sentiment that is quietly but widely shared in Washington, especially among Democrats. Even as they admit to being in disarray, they say, what the fuck are we doing? A Democrat lobbyist fumed. What the fuck is the DNC doing? I'm on their listserv and I haven't gotten a fucking thing, have you? Every woman I've seen on social media that's so mad, I've seen no link, hey, here's where you vote. I don't think that suggesting that voting is the solution to this is any reasonable response. You need to actually prove to the American people that you are legislatively, if you have control of the House, Senate, and the presidency, going to do something about it. You have to actually prove that in order to motivate them. So saying just here's a link to vote is obviously not going to be enough, but they continue saying if this was the GOP side, that whole apparatus would be mobilized from the Koch brothers to the NRA to big oil. They would be efficiently mobilizing their base right now. Instead, from Democrats, we had that pathetic interview from Kamala Harris where she was straight up asked, like, what are you guys actually materially doing to push back against this? Do you want to have abortion clinics on federal lands? Do you want to, pay for women to travel across states? What do you want to do in this entire process? And the whole response from Kamala Harris was basically just vote in the midterms. Just vote so we can have, I guess, hold on to our tiny minority or a tiny majority, slim margins that we have right now, or vote so that we can maybe add 1 or 2 more members to the House or the Senate and be basically back in the same position that we are right now. So again, completely pathetic response, both from an actual substantive angle in doing something to protect abortion rights, but also just from a political angle in mobilizing your base, getting people motivated to go out there and actually support Democrats. If you have people coming out and basically saying they're not willing to use the strategies that could be put in place, getting rid of the filibuster, codifying Roe v. Wade, then why the fuck would people be incentivized to vote for you? But she continues saying, asked what they expected to see from fellow Democrats, the lobbyist responded, I think that we're going to see a lot of hashtags and some rallies and a lot of useless shit. And that's exactly what we've been seeing so far. But she continues saying, even people who advise Planned Parenthood told me the organization has little idea and still fewer plans for what to do at the national level other than to fundraise and tell people to vote in the midterms. It's a call that Democrats themselves know rings hollow. They called on their supporters to vote, even though voting in 2018 didn't stop Mitch McConnell from ramming through Amy Coney Barrett's nomination in 15 days, and a direct reversal of his own doctrine that stole Merrick Garland's seat in 2016. And Democrats voted bigger, better, harder in 2020, got the White House, the Senate, and the House, and still didn't get them a Green New Deal, paid family leave, or really much else on their legislative wish list, nor did it help them despite the House passing the Hail Mary bill to codify Roe into law to save the 50-year-old abortion rights precedent. And it turns out that telling people to vote and vote and vote some more in a system designed for minority rule and where gerrymandering requires the Democrats to produce bigger and bigger turnout for smaller and smaller margins in Washington can start to ring a bit hollow. How can you vote and win and still lose so badly? Through the din of rage on social media and spontaneous protests in the street, even the most dedicated Democrats could hear the unmistakable echoing sound of defeat. But understand, I mean, this is what Democrats thrive on. This is what gets them their biggest fundraising numbers, is being defeated, being the victims in the political sense, while actual millions of women across the country are real victims of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, they had years to do this. They could have done it under the Obama administration, where he said that it was his top legislative priority. Then he takes office and basically says, I don't really have any urge to do this. And even when he had a supermajority control of Congress, he still didn't do it. You had an opportunity to try to push the members of your own party, Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, to do this, to get rid of the filibuster, codify it at the federal level. You had a month to try to whip those votes in place. They did absolutely nothing. They've had for 50 years now the opportunity to codify this at the federal level, and they didn't do it for a pretty simple reason. I mean, obviously it's a multitude of reasons, but one of the biggest ones is that they legitimately want to use this indefinitely as a political wedge issue in order to motivate people to keep showing up and voting for them, basically holding voters hostage by holding their human rights hostage, essentially, but also as a fundraising mechanism. So she continues with a little bit more details on that, saying Democrats seem to agree with their resignation of their fate of losing in the midterms and losing on the Roe v. Wade issue, saying, quote, "Since I got to D.C. over a decade ago, the thinking was that repealing Roe v. Wade would never happen because smart Republicans knew that it was bad politics, that they would walk right up to the line and not do it because if they did, Democrats thought it would give them a landslide," a Democratic strategist told me. I guess you can call me a Democratic strategist, whatever. He doesn't really consider himself to be one, I guess. But he says now Democrats are realizing that that's not the case and they can't just simply rely on this issue to bail them out of their pathetic state that they are in right now. But they continue saying it is unlikely that nearly enough white Republican women will start voting Democratic because of this issue, which is in part what Democrats have been counting on. And increased Democratic turnout has to be in the exact right places to make a real difference in Washington. And he says, I asked the strategist, if we can call him that, why Democrats had made these assumptions if they now seem to be so obviously off the mark. And he said, because they were wrong and dumb. They were wrong and dumb. Yeah, I mean, 100% correct. And he said it's the same reason they thought all Hispanics would continue to vote Democratic. I think Democrats are in for a rude awakening in November, and he's 100% right. I mean, obviously, this is going to have some impact on the political situation going into the midterms, but you still have inflation, you still have sky-high grocery prices and gas prices right now, and when it comes down to it, usually economic issues are going to be the top issues of any given election. So maybe it will help Democrats on the margins. Is it going to be enough for them to maintain control of the House and the Senate? I don't really know. We'll have to see how this plays out. Obviously, you have months and months until the elections actually take place, so the longer time gap between when this decision came out and when the election is going to be is obviously just going to continue trailing off as time goes on and people, sort of push this into the background as other ridiculous shit keeps happening in this country. So yet to be seen exactly how effective this is going to be in a political sense. But finally, she continued down here saying, what I found striking in my conversations over the weekend, however, wasn't what Democrats told me, but what Republicans did. They were all careful not to gloat and to frame this not as an issue of women's bodily autonomy, but as one of restoring a measure of democracy to the people living in conservative anti-abortion states. Just an absolutely ridiculous notion here that returning this issue to the states is somehow enhancing democracy in any way, shape, or form. I mean, go and look at every single one of the conservative states around the country that are currently outlawing abortion. They're all gerrymandered to shit, usually along racial lines, and have racially gerrymandered districts, which intentionally set out to disempower minority voters, disempower working class voters, and enshrine minority control within these state legislatures, which they then use to further gerrymander them, further pass voting laws that restrict the right to vote, and entrench their power in these states where they use their minority rule in order to do extremely unpopular things like this. So the idea that there is any democracy within this entire process is an absolute fucking joke. But they continue saying, They were also shocked at how little Democrats were doing to fight them when such a clear path of retaliation lay open to them while they control the House and the Senate. And this is a Republican operative saying this. He says, if I were the libs, I would be putting forward a flurry of legislation like making birth control free and widely available, which is something that Justice Clarence Thomas openly said that they were going to be going after next. He says, if you say it's not widely available enough, go after that, cover the gaps, don't go for the really big stuff, just split the GOP conference as much as you can and force people to vote. If the goal is really protecting women or advancing legislation that could actually pass, then take every potential approach that you can. Instead, we've gotten basically nothing from Democrats. And she finishes off here saying, in other words, Republicans are saying that Democrats should be forcing them onto the record with votes that chip away at their stated pro-life position. If you're so worried about infant life, in other words, let's have a vote on free diapers and free childcare. We know exactly what Republicans would do in that instance. But if you say it's not a gun issue, but a mental health issue, let's vote on funding the shit out of mental health. And see, the problem is Republicans will never vote on that shit. They have absolutely no problem with being complete and utter hypocrites. There's no way that you can burn them on that or try to convince them that, somehow they should change their minds. So you have to force this through with the slim majorities that you have right now in the House and the Senate. If you don't have the votes, if Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin want to be holdouts, then you get out the big whipping stick. You go, you publicly call them out. You work with them in order to get whatever, maybe it's some version of Roe v. Wade codified at the federal level. You do the filibuster carve out and you get it fucking done. I mean, that's what you would do if you actually cared about protecting abortion rights or, again, putting through any of those other priorities that she was listing there. Do a child care bill, do anything that, would materially improve the lives of actual born children in this country. I mean, so many different ways that you could try to split apart the GOP as a block and try to point out holes in their logic, but instead, basically, Democrats are just saying, we're going to fundraise off of this. So it's just, completely pathetic and ineffective situation that we have on our hands here. But now I want to finish off here with a little bit from this article from Lever News, David Serrata's outlet that he posts on, and I think he had a great breakdown here in terms of what type of mindset that actual average voters should have right now in a moment like this, in terms of getting the Democratic Party to fear their base as much as the Republican Party fears their base. So I skipped down to the bottom of this article, but I do recommend you go and read it in its entirety because I think that this entire thing is noteworthy. But I'm just going to start off right here. He says there are signs that at this dangerously late hour that normie Democrat voters might have finally had enough of this shit from Democrats, talking about the inaction. And so just some of the details on some polling data that we got recently. He says, last month, a stat buried in the NBC News poll showed that nearly 2/3 of Democratic voters say they now want a candidate who proposes larger scale policies that cost more and might be harder to pass into law, but could bring major change. Just a third said that they prefer a candidate who proposes smaller scale policies that cost less and might be easier to pass into law, but would bring less change on these issues. So, I mean, this is just definitively proving that Bernie Sanders' approach to how he wanted to operate the presidency is infinitely more popular than Joe Biden's approach or the, Joe Manchin approach to Democratic politics. People don't want, smaller scale policies that aren't really going to materially improve their lives in any substantial way. They want big, bold changes because our country is completely fucking falling apart at the seams. So, it shouldn't be shocking or surprising, but again, it's pretty amazing how polling data like this basically just exposes that Joe Biden's entire governing philosophy as the president of the United States is not only wildly unpopular among the American people, but also wildly unpopular even within his own party. So, shouldn't be shocking that we're seeing polling data come out showing that like 70% of the American people don't want Joe Biden to run again in 2024. But more polling data here. He says, put another way, 63% of the party is finally radicalized and just 33% are still clinging to the normie view. This might explain why a group of progressive congressional challengers recently overcame the odds and won their primaries, even against party leaders' endorsement. And at the same time, a Fairleigh Dickinson University survey found a plurality of Americans no longer buy Democrats' argument that they have no power to do anything. And that includes a quarter of Democrats and nearly half of independents, and a full 50% of Democrats say President Biden has the power to reduce inflation and healthcare costs. And this is 100% a fact. I wish that this number was higher than 50%, but he does have the ability as the president of the United States, both through executive orders and in his capacity to pressure the members of his own party to push forward legislation through Congress. He 100% has the ability to make this situation better. He's just basically resigned to letting Joe Manchin be the president and and, letting the Federal Reserve plunge our economy into a recession at the expense of the working class so that he doesn't have to actually confront the corporations who are currently price gouging the American people. But finally, just one more piece of polling data here. He says Quinnipiac's new poll also showed just a quarter of young voters approve of the way that Biden is handling his job, and his numbers are similarly low among Black and Latino voters. So in other words, the entire fucking base of the Democratic Party. I mean, again, I've talked about this so many different times on this channel, how disproportionately the trail off in Biden's approval rating has been coming from young voters, and young voters are significantly to the left of Joe Biden. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the American people are to the left of Joe Biden on things like healthcare and economic stimulus, etc. I mean, so many different things we could talk about here, and instead we're basically just left with the Democratic Party that is resigned to their fate. I mean, they would rather spend this time right now sending out fundraising emails, reading poems to the American people, singing their little songs on the steps of the Supreme Court, and actually doing nothing of substance to codify abortion rights at the federal level, or really do anything, even just the mild compromises that were within a bill like Build Back Better, really do anything to materially improve the lives of average Americans and prove to them that they deserve not to be slaughtered in the 2022 midterm elections.